By 1860, Italy's fate was not finished with him yet. This was the year that would define his legend, a year that would reshape the map of Italy forever. It began not with glory, but with betrayal. On January the 24th, Garibaldi married 18-year-old Giuseppina Raimondi. Hours later, she revealed she was pregnant by another man. Garibaldi walked out on her that same day, cold, swift, final, but heartbreak didn't hold him. Just a few months later, as uprisings flared in Sicily, Messina and Palermo rising against the Bourbon rule, Garibaldi seized his moment. On the evening of May the 5th, he and a ragged band of just over 1,000 volunteers, known ever after as E. Miller or the Thousand, set sail from Genoa aboard 2 stolen ships. Their destination? Marsala, Sicily. Their mission? The unification of Italy. Landing in western Sicily, Garibaldi quickly rallied locals to his cause. Then, on May 15th, he faced a much larger Bourbon force at Calatafimi. The odds were against him. The hill the enemy occupied loomed ahead, but Garibaldi, ever the gambler with fate, saw a hidden path. The hill's ancient terraces could protect his men from enemy fire. He ordered an uphill bayonet charge. It worked. Garibaldi's 800 men broke through the 1,500 Bourbon troops. Victory against the odds. Legend says he turned to his officer Nino Bixio and declared, "Here we make Italy or we die." Either way, history was being written. From there he moved on to Palermo, the jewel of Sicily. There in late May, with popular support and sheer nerve, he launched a siege. The fighting was brutal. The city was bombarded nearly to rubble. But then, a twist. A British admiral stepped in and negotiated a truce. The Neapolitan forces surrendered and withdrew, and Palermo was his. And now the world was watching. Garibaldi declared himself dictator of Sicily in the name of King Victor Emmanuel II. It was a surprising move. The staunch Republican now fought under a monarchy's banner, a sign that Garibaldi was no longer chasing revolution, but unification. By July, he'd pushed east and crushed the Bourbon forces again at Milazzo. Only the citadel held out. Sicily was his. But Garibaldi wasn't done. He crossed the Strait of Messina into mainland Italy, and to wild cheers rode into Naples by train on September 7th. The Neapolitan government collapsed before him like a house of cards. But the Neapolitan army wasn't quite finished. At the Battle of Volturno in late September, Garibaldi fought his largest battle yet. It was close, bloody, chaotic. But then, as if Italy herself willed it, the Royal Sardinian army arrived, and the tide turned. Victory was now complete, or nearly so. In the background, political storms were brewing. Count Cavour, the wily Piedmontese prime minister, feared Garibaldi's wild momentum might carry him all the way to Rome, dragging Italy into war with France. He distrusted Garibaldi, resented him. And Garibaldi? He returned the sentiment, bitterly. He loathed Cavour for ceding his beloved niece to the French the year before, but in contrast Garibaldi still admired King Victor Emmanuel, the monarch he had once called a man of destiny. And so, on October 26th, 1860, on a quiet bridge near the town of Teano, the revolutionary met the king. Garibaldi saluted Victor Emmanuel as King of Italy and offered him command of the army. No demands, no reward, just the unity of a nation handed over with a handshake. A few days later they rode side by side into Naples. The people wept and cheered. Then, as if he'd simply finished his day's work, Garibaldi quietly retired to his farm on the island of Caprera. No titles, no fortune, just the satisfaction of knowing that he had changed the course of history. Again. Back on Caprera, Garibaldi nursed his wounds, not just the physical ones from battle, but the deeper ache of an unfinished mission. Italy may have a king and a flag, but in his eyes it was still not complete. Rome, the sacred prize, the soul of the nation, remained in the hands of the Pope, guarded by foreign troops and shielded by old superstitions. Garibaldi didn't just want Rome, He burned for it. His hatred for the papacy wasn't subtle. He saw the Pope not as a holy man, but as a tyrant, a ruler of men and land rather than spirits and souls. In Garibaldi's world, religion belonged to the heart, not the throne. His excommunication by the Pope only strengthened his cause. He famously appointed a Protestant pastor as his army chaplain, as if to make the break official. In 1862, he launched his most defiant campaign yet. From Genoa to Palermo, he gathered another army of red shirts, young idealists, revolutionaries, ex-soldiers. They marched under a new rallying cry, Roma o morte, Rome or death. But this time, Italy's newly minted government wasn't on his side. King Victor Emmanuel and his advisers feared international backlash, especially from France, which had stationed troops in Rome to protect the Pope. Still, Garibaldi believed, maybe naively, that the king secretly supported him. He landed in Calabria and moved through the mountains, dreaming of another lightning conquest like in Sicily. But this time, the dream unravelled. The Italian government, under General Enrico Cialdini, sent regular troops to intercept him. On the slopes of the Aspromonte Massif, Garibaldi's volunteers were surrounded. A single nervous shot rang out, then volleys followed. Garibaldi was hit in the foot. He ordered his men not to return fire. They were all Italians now. Brothers, not enemies. The rebellion ended almost as soon as it began. Garibaldi, wounded and humiliated, was taken prisoner, but treated with the strange respect of a national hero gone rogue. He was shipped off to a quiet imprisonment in Varignano, where doctors operated on his mangled foot. Europe, however, still admired him. Sympathy poured in from all sides. In Italy, children even sang about the incident in a nursery rhyme, Garibaldi fu ferito. Garibaldi was wounded. When he healed, the government quietly let him go, and he returned once again to his windswept island. But exile didn't silence him. In 1864, Garibaldi made a triumphant tour of England. His arrival in London caused a sensation. Crowds flooded Trafalgar Square, cheering the old general like a rock star. He met with Prime Minister Viscount Palmerston and dined with European revolutionaries. His dreams were now even bigger than Italy. He spoke of liberating Croatia, Greece, Hungary, anywhere people yearned for freedom. But always, his eyes turned back to Rome. The church still ruled, the Pope still wore his crown. Garibaldi? He was still waiting for the right moment to strike. By the year 1866, Garibaldi was 60 years old. The idealism was still burning, the beard still wild, the fire in his heart undimmed. Italy was unified in name, but still incomplete in territory and divided in loyalty. This time, though, the call to arms came not from a secret plot or personal passion. It came with the full backing of the Italian government. The Austro-Prussian War had broken out. Prussia went to war against the Austrian Empire, and Italy seized the moment. The deal was simple. Italy would join Prussia, and in return, Venetia, still under Austrian control, would be theirs. It was known as the Third Italian War of Independence. Garibaldi answered the call. He raised the Cacciatori delle Alpi, the Hunters of the Alps, again. Not a ragtag band of idealists this time, but a formidable force of 40,000 men. They surged into the mountains of Trentino, heading straight for Austrian positions. At Bezzecca, Garibaldi delivered one of his most brilliant victories. His troops pushed the Austrians back and made for the key city of Trento. It looked as though, once again, he would claim a triumph that the regular army could not. But while Garibaldi was winning in the mountains, the Italian navy suffered a humiliating defeat at Lissa. On land, the Italian forces had fared no better at Custoza. The momentum stalled. Then came the news. Austria and Italy had agreed to an armistice. Venetia would be handed over, not because of Italy's might, but because of Prussia's victories to the north. Garibaldi's campaign, fierce and full of promise, was suddenly rendered pointless. From the main square of Bezzecca, Garibaldi sent a single-word telegram in reply to the government's order to halt his advance. Obbedisco, I obey. That word, short and sharp, became legendary. Even in disappointment, Garibaldi kept his dignity. He had followed orders, but his heart was still set on Rome. By 1867, he was at it again. The Eternal City, still under papal control, remained a symbol of resistance to the dream of full Italian unity. Once more, Garibaldi raised a volunteer army and marched toward the city. But this time, the odds were stacked against him. The papal army, now bolstered by a French auxiliary force, stood firm. Garibaldi's men were poorly armed, outnumbered, and outgunned. At the Battle of Mentana, he was shot in the leg and forced to retreat. The Italian government, anxious not to provoke an international crisis, threw him back into prison. When he was released, he returned to Caprera, older, slower, but still far from done. Later that year, Garibaldi travelled to Geneva to attend the Congress of the League of Peace and Freedom. There, the ageing warrior gave a speech that would shock even his most radical supporters. The papacy, he declared, being the most harmful of all secret societies, ought to be abolished. It was bold, inflammatory, and very, very Garibaldi. As the fires of revolution dimmed across Europe, Giuseppe Garibaldi's never quite went out. In 1871, the streets of Paris erupted in flames. The Paris Commune, short-lived, chaotic, and fiercely idealistic, was a call to arms for radicals across the world. Garibaldi, now in his 60s, and long retired to his island of Caprera, threw his full weight behind the communards. To him, they weren't dangerous revolutionaries. They were brothers in arms. He allied himself with younger radicals like Felice Cavallotti and dreamed of a grand alliance: Freemasons, Democrats, rationalists, workers' clubs, mutual aid societies, all unified in a single movement for liberty and equality. Why don't we pull together, he asked. We all want the same thing. Against government orders, Garibaldi helped organise a Congress of Unity, held boldly in Rome's Teatro Argentina. It was a defiant gathering, banned but unstoppable, and it endorsed radical reforms: universal suffrage, compulsory secular education, progressive taxation, administrative reform, and the abolition of the death penalty. For Garibaldi, this wasn't just politics, it was a moral calling. He had long admired the ethical socialism of Henri Saint-Simon and saw liberty not as a national right but a human one. He made no distinction between the African and the American, the European and the Asian. Fraternity of all men, he said, whatever nation they belong to. Garibaldi didn't believe in abolishing property. He wasn't a Marxist, but he fiercely defended the First International and the Communards against conservative attacks. To him, they were not dangerous radicals, but the inevitable response to an unjust world. Is it not the product of the abnormal state in which society finds itself, he asked. Shouldn't a society where the majority struggle to survive while a minority take the fruits of their labour through deception and violence, shouldn't that arouse discontent? In a letter to the activist Celso Caretti, Garibaldi wrote the words that would echo through Italy's radical left. The International is the sun of the future, il sol dell'avvenire. Printed in newspapers and pamphlets across the country, Garibaldi's letter tipped many undecided workers into the arms of the International. After his death, many of his followers embraced the libertarian socialism of Mikhail Bakunin. But Garibaldi's brand of socialism was his own, grounded in the dignity of labour, the rejection of injustice, and a deep belief in human goodness. In 1879, alongside Cavallotti, Alberto Mario, and Agostino Bertani, he founded the League of Democracy. It called for the abolition of church property, universal suffrage, legal equality for women, and ambitious public works to improve the countryside around Rome. Though Italy still lacked a proper industrial working class, Garibaldi's socialism, craft-based, ethical, and emotional, resonated deeply. As Lucy Riel put it, he had now moved to the left of Mazzini. The death of his old friend and rival in 1872 signalled the end of one era and the rise of another. Garibaldi's politics no longer echoed the spirit of 1848. They now burned with the fire of 1871. Despite his age and infirmities, Garibaldi returned to Parliament, first with the historical left, then the historical far left. He pushed through land reclamation projects in southern Lazio and never stopped campaigning for a freer, fairer Italy. But Garibaldi's dreams were never confined to Italy. In October of 1875, he wrote a fiery letter to the oppressed peoples of Eastern Europe, calling for resistance to the Ottoman Empire. In vivid language, he cast the Turks as wolves and marauders who had descended upon the cradle of European civilization. He named heroes from their past, Leonidas, Achilles, Skanderbeg, Spartacus, and urged the Balkan peoples to rise again, this time for good. To Brusa with the Turk, he wrote, only thus can you make yourself independent and free. It was a call for liberation, penned from a rocking chair on a windswept island by a man who still saw injustice as an invitation to act. Garibaldi's revolution never died. It just changed shape. What had begun with swords and ships had become letters and speeches, gatherings and congresses, moral clarity and radical hope. From Montevideo to Sicily, from the Alps to the Balkans, from Caprera to Paris, Garibaldi had fought for the people, and the people never forgot. It was the 2nd of June, 1882, and the wind moved gently across the island of Caprera. The old revolutionary, now almost 75, lay confined to his bed, the once unbreakable limbs stiffened by years of struggle and the grip of arthritis. He had stopped riding horses, had stopped marching, but the fire behind his eyes never quite faded. Those who visited him in those last months said his voice was still firm, his gaze still piercing. The cause, any cause that fought injustice, still lived in him. His home on Caprera was simple, surrounded by olive trees, sun-bleached stone, and the familiar scent of the sea. Salt hung in the air, birds wheeled overhead. Just beyond the window, the Tyrrhenian Sea shimmered under the June light. He asked for his bed to be moved closer to the open window so he could see it. His sea, the one that had carried him to Sicily, to Naples, to freedom. His last wife, Francesca Armosino, was at his side. They had married just 2 years earlier, but had already shared a life and 3 children. Around him were others, some of his surviving children, old comrades, loyal islanders, who had come to respect him not as a myth or military hero, but as a neighbour, a man. They watched over him in quiet reverence, brushing his hand, smoothing his sheets, whispering memories of bold years and distant shores. He was no longer a general or a politician. He was just Giuseppe, farmer, husband, father, a man who had sailed beyond every horizon he had once dreamed of. Outside, the air was warm, thick, with the scent of rosemary and the dry earth of early summer. Somewhere nearby, goats stirred. The waves lapped gently against the Caprera coast. The birds were quiet, and in that moment, looking out to the water, surrounded by those he loved, Giuseppe Garibaldi died. He asked for a simple funeral, for cremation, but the state didn't grant him that. They wanted to preserve the body of the man who had become a symbol, a legend. He was buried on his own land beneath the island sky, alongside Francesca and some of his children. No grand procession, no royal tomb, just the earth, the sea, and silence. Garibaldi never wanted to be a king. He wanted to free kings' subjects. He never craved riches. He lived simply, often poorly. He had no taste for courts or parliaments or the bureaucracy of the state. He was above all a man of action and belief. But history wouldn't let him rest quietly. He became a myth while still alive, more famous than Cavour, more beloved than Mazzini, more universal than Verdi. To the world outside Italy, Garibaldi was Italy, its passion, its courage, its wild romantic heart. The red shirt, the broad chest, the wind-swept hair, the sword in one hand and justice in the other. He had fought for no reward, crossed oceans for strangers, and liberated millions. He had been the hero of Montevideo, the lion of Marsala, the champion of Rome, the prophet of Paris. Even in death he was not forgotten. He lives on in statues, in schools, in streets bearing his name from Milan to Buenos Aires. But more than that, he lives on in the idea that one person, flawed, fiery, stubborn, but full of belief, can reshape the world. That liberty isn't just something to hope for, but something to fight for, to walk toward, one dusty step at a time. And so, when the sea breeze moves through Caprera, when the ships cross from Sardinia to the mainland, when a boy picks up a history book and reads about a man in a red shirt who marched not for glory but for justice, he lives again. He was not a saint, he was not perfect, but he was unforgettable. He was Giuseppe Garibaldi, and he was just passing through.